video, we're going to take our information about triads and move it up one notch. We're going to talk about triads in inversion. Now, for us to understand inversion, we have to first of all understand what that concept is, what that means. Once we understand what it means to invert, then we can understand what it means to invert a triad. So the term inversion simply means to take the lower notes and move them up above the upper notes. So if, again, like most things in music theory, it's more easily demonstrated and it is really verbalized. So let me show you. I can invert this interval. This is a third, it happens to be a major third. I can invert it by taking the lowest note up an octave. And that gives me this interval. So this third becomes instead this sixth. And the concept of inversion is quite simple. I've taken the lowest note up an octave and it's created a different interval. Now logically, I could go on. I could now invert this sixth and take the lowest note up an octave, and I would end up with, lo and behold, the third that I began with, simply an octave higher. And, you know, hopefully that's not so amazing, like, wow, how did he do that? It's, he ought to go onto the stage and do some magic, because that's phenomenal. It's not phenomenal. I've just taken the lower note up an octave, then I took what was the new lower note up an octave, and because there are two notes involved, I can do that one time before I end up back where I started, right? That makes sense. That's the concept of inversion. Now, I can do that with more than two notes, and that's where we get to triads in inversion. So let's look at that, just as a concept. Let me start, again, with a basic triad. This time, we'll start with an F major triad. It's F, A, and C. Pretty straightforward, I would hope. Now, how am I going to invert it? I'm going to do exactly the same thing I did with the interval. I'm just going to be able to do it more often because there's more notes involved. So I'm going to take the bottom note F up an octave, and I'm going to end up with this inversion. It's the same chord. I haven't changed anything about the chord. The same three notes are involved. They're just presented differently. They're presented differently because they are in inversion, as we would say. The bottom note has been taken up an octave, and that has changed the note that is the lowest note of the chord. It has changed that so that a different note is on the bottom. I've done that by simply moving what was the lowest note up an octave, right? Now, because there's three notes, I can do that again. I can now take the new bottom note and I can move it up to here. I've changed it again. I'm not back exactly to where I began because I've got three notes, and I'm able to go through two inversions before I get back. If I now take the bottom note here up again and invert it again, yep, there I end up back now. Now I've got an F major triad that is an octave higher than where I started, because I've started with this original triad and I've inverted it one time, then I've inverted it a second time, and then I've ended up back where I started, just an octave higher. That's the concept of inversion. All you're doing is taking the bottom note up an octave, and it is creating a chord that has a new bottom note, a new bass note, for want of a better word. Now, what we do is we refer to these triads in specific ways. We already know that this is the root, this is the third, and this is the fifth. Root, third, and fifth of the triad. We're clear about that. That was in the last video. So what we do is we refer to this as root position. Root position because the root is in the bass. It's the lowest note. We refer to this when you move the bottom note, the root, up an octave. You end up then with the third of the chord in the bass. We call that first inversion. This has root in bass. This has third of the chord. Right? This is the root, the third, and the fifth. In root position, the root is in the bass. When I invert that by taking the root up an octave, I end up with the third of the chord in the bass. It's called first inversion. because it's the first time that we've taken the bass note that was in the beginning, the root note, up an octave. And we've created a new bass note, a new lowest note. So what I mean when I say the bass note is the lowest note. All right? And then, of course, I can do it again. And surprisingly, I'm sure this is not going to be a surprise to you when I do this again, I now put the fifth of the chord in the lowest position, in the bass position. And because the fifth chord of the chord is in the position, it's the second time I've done it. We call that second inversion. And second inversion puts the fifth of the chord into the bass. That is to say, it makes the fifth of the chord the lowest note. So we have the root of the chord in the lowest part, creating root position. The third of the chord in the lowest part, creating first inversion. Or the fifth of the chord in the lowest part, creating second inversion. Notice that the definition of the inversion, first inversion, second inversion, or root position, is entirely about which note is in the bass. Now, in this case, it's very easy to say there are only 3 notes being played, and there are 3 notes being used, therefore we can see the root is the lowest note, the third is the lowest note, the fifth is the lowest note. It's very obvious to us. If I were to write these same 3 notes out, but I was to use it in a different context, I was to write it out so that we had, say for example, a bass player, a rhythm guitar player, and a violinist playing. And let's say that the rhythm guitar player was playing the chord G, and as they played the chord G, they were sounding various notes that were in the chord of G, all right? That the violin was playing the note G at the top, over the top, and then underneath all of that, in the bass guitar player was playing the note G, very low down on the bass, all right? Now notice, those are all the notes, G, B, and D. Those are all the notes of a G major chord. That is a G major triad. All right, it's got G, B, and D in it. It doesn't matter what inversion it's in, it's a G major. This is an F major triad, doesn't matter what inversion it's in. This is an F major triad in root position, this is an F major triad in first inversion, this is an F major triad in second inversion. This is a G major triad. It doesn't matter what inversion, it's G major because it's got G, B, and D, and that's a third, that's a major third, and that's a minor third. That's why it's a G major triad. It's got all the characteristics of a triad, and it's got all the characteristics primarily and specifically of a major triad. So, what position is this in? Is this in root position? Is it in first inversion? Is it in second inversion? It's in root position because the lowest sounding note is the root of the chord. Now I may not change anything else. Everything else may stay the same, but then the bass player suddenly starts playing the third of the chord in the bass. Right? The bass player's gone from playing the bass, now he's playing the third of the chord in the bass. Right? Now it's in first inversion. Doesn't matter what these notes are above. It matters what this note is on the bottom. That's the important note. So now there's the third of the chord of G is being played in the bass. That now is in first inversion. Now, let's do the logical next thing, all right? Now the bass player starts playing the fifth of the chord in the bass. What inversion is this chord? It doesn't matter what goes on above. Doesn't matter. This now is in second inversion because the lowest sounding note is now the note, the fifth of the chord. It's the note D. So I hope what you're getting from this is that root position, first inversion, and second inversion is not so much about how these are adjusted or written out on the page. It's about this note at the bottom. Which is the bass note? If you know whether or not the root or the third or the fifth of the chord is in the bass, that will determine the inversion. But for ease of writing it out, for ease of seeing it, we often see them written in a simple one-staff format like this. So you have a triadic structure like this, or a triadic structure like this, or a triadic structure like this. This is triadic structure. This is first inversion. This is second inversion. They're all the same chord. It's all an F chord. It is simply whether or not it is in root position, first inversion or second inversion, which is defined by which note is the lowest sounding note. So that is triads in inversion. And what you should be able to do, what you should work toward being able to do, is recognizing not only whether triads are major, minor, augmented, or diminished. You certainly need to be able to do that. But you should also then be able to identify whether or not they are in root position, first inversion, or second inversion. And you'll identify that by observing which is the lowest note in the bass. If the root is in the bass, it's in root position. If the third is in the bass, it is in first inversion. If the fifth is in the bass, it is in second inversion. And it's all about the bass note. What note is in the bass? Doesn't matter what's going on above. However many notes you might have above, it matters what is the bass note. That is what is defining the inversion.